everyone, and welcome back. So today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a topic that you've been exploring, the world of therapy.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, you sent over some really interesting material, some excerpts from a book on mindfulness and acceptance, and then also a few audio lectures. And what I found so interesting is this idea that therapy has evolved in these waves of change.
Yeah, it really is fascinating to see how we've kind of progressed through these waves of therapy. And now we're really looking at a different way of understanding mental health and well-being.
Yeah, and it's so cool because we get to kind of go through this progression with you. And so let's start with this first wave. It seems pretty straightforward, right? You tackle the symptoms head on. So like exposure therapy for phobias, things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, you're looking at direct symptom relief and just focusing on those observable behaviors.
Okay, so then we move to the second wave where there's more of a focus on thoughts and beliefs. So CBT is a great example of that, particularly for depression. But then both of these waves kind of hit a ceiling in terms of their effectiveness.
Yeah. And that's where things get really interesting, right?
Right.
It's not that they stopped working,
Yeah.
but there was room for improvement.
Yeah, so what were the signs that things needed to change?
Well, research started showing some puzzling results. For instance, people were showing improvement in CBT even before they really dug into the core techniques.
Mm.
And, sometimes changes in thoughts didn't fully explain why people were getting better, almost like we were missing part of the puzzle.
Mm.
At the same time, we saw this plateau in how much these therapies could help. And there was a growing concern about relying too heavily on rigid treatment manuals. All of this created a real need for some fresh thinking.
Oh, okay. So that's where this third wave comes in. And you had mentioned some names before we started recording: acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, and then mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or MBCT.
Right.
Was this shift in thinking a response to those limitations we just talked about?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Those limitations really created a fertile ground for these new ideas.
Mm.
And what unites these third wave therapies is this focus on mindfulness, acceptance, and really emphasizing the importance of the therapeutic relationship.
Okay.
So instead of just targeting the form of thoughts and feelings, like what they look like, they focus on their function, what purpose they serve.
Oh, that's a really interesting distinction, but I have to admit the idea of acceptance, especially when it comes to things like anxiety, kind of freaks me out a little bit. Wouldn't that just make it worse?
That's a great question and a really common concern. It seems
Yeah.
counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But that's where we need to understand what acceptance really means in this context. It's not about liking or approving of difficult emotions. It's about making space for them, acknowledging their presence without judgment.
So it's more about acknowledging those thoughts and feelings rather than trying to fight them or push them away.
Exactly.
But how does that actually work?
Think of it this way. When we resist our experiences, we actually give them more power. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater.
Oh, yeah.
The more you push it down, the more it fights back.
Yeah.
Acceptance, on the other hand, is like letting go of the struggle.
Okay, that makes sense. So are these third wave therapies like ACT and DBT, are they mainly about acceptance?
Acceptance is a key ingredient, but there's more to it than that. These therapies offer a whole toolkit of techniques and practices, and mindfulness plays a big role.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about mindfulness, but I have to admit, I still don't really get it. So what does it actually mean to be mindful, especially in the context of therapy?
Mindfulness is about paying attention to the present moment without judgment. It's like stepping out of the constant stream of thoughts and just observing what's happening both internally and externally.
So it's not about emptying your mind or stopping your thoughts altogether. It's more about changing how you relate to them.
Exactly. It's about noticing your thoughts, feelings, and sensations without getting caught up in them. And there are specific techniques that can help with that, like the milk exercise from ACT.
Oh, vaguely. I think you mentioned that when we were prepping for this. It's about repeating a word over and over until it kind of loses all meaning, right?
Yes, by repeating the word milk over and over, it starts to sound strange, almost meaningless.
Yeah.
You start to notice the sound of the word rather than its meaning. And this same principle can be applied to thoughts.
Yeah.
We can learn to see them as just thoughts, mental events, not necessarily truths. And there are also visualization exercises like the soldiers in the parade, where you see your thoughts marching by, but you're not engaging with them, just observing.
Oh, I love that visual. That makes so much more sense. So with mindfulness, you're creating this space between you and your thoughts. But what about those really intense emotions like anxiety or anger? How does acceptance play into that?
That's where things get really interesting. These therapies, particularly DBT, emphasize the importance of validation. And it's not just the therapist validating the client's experience, but also the client learning to validate their own emotions. It's about recognizing that all emotions, even the uncomfortable ones, are a natural part of being human.
So you're not trying to get rid of the emotion, but you're also not letting it control you.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. And it seems like this ties into something we were talking about earlier, this link between acceptance and Eastern philosophies like Zen Buddhism.
Absolutely. Zen Buddhism has been practicing acceptance for centuries. It's about recognizing reality as it is without clinging to what we wish it would be.
Yeah.
And that can be a really powerful shift in perspective,
Yeah.
especially for someone like you who is used to analyzing and trying to control their experience.
Oh, that is me, always trying to figure things out, find the solutions.
Yeah.
So how do these therapies help people move from acceptance to actual change? Because,
Yeah.
it's one thing to accept anxiety, it's another thing to actually feel less anxious.
That's where values and committed action come in. And this is a key distinction from earlier therapies. It's not just about reducing symptoms. It's about building a life that is rich and meaningful, even in the presence of those symptoms.
So it's about figuring out what's truly important to you and then taking action based on those values, even if anxiety or other difficult emotions are present.
Exactly. In ACT, for example, there's this concept called the ever-widening dare cycle.
Oh, I remember that. But honestly, I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
It's a beautiful metaphor for how we can gradually step outside our comfort zone, guided by our values. Imagine a series of concentric circles, like a target. The smallest circle represents your current comfort zone, and each larger circle represents a slightly bigger challenge. By taking small, committed actions, you gradually expand your comfort zone, building your confidence and resilience along the way.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of this fits together. We've got mindfulness to create some space between us and our thoughts, acceptance to make peace with our emotions, and then values-driven action to move us toward the life we want to live. But how do we know if any of this actually works? Are these just feel-good ideas, or is there evidence to support them?
It's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And I'm happy to say that the research is catching up with the theory. We're seeing really promising results across a range of conditions.
Like, give me some specifics. What kind of results are we talking about?
Well, you mentioned struggling with anxiety. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, NBCT, has been shown to reduce relapse rates in recurrent depression by a whopping 50%.
Wow.
And while your experience is unique, this suggests similar potential for managing anxiety as well. That kind of reduction is significant, wouldn't you say?
That's huge. I mean, cutting your chances of relapse in half? Sign me up.
And there's more. ACT is showing real promise in treating things like psychosis and substance abuse. And then DBT has been incredibly effective in reducing self-harm and suicide attempts.
So this isn't just about feeling a little less anxious. These therapies are tackling some really serious issues. That's pretty amazing.
It is, and it speaks to the power of these approaches, how they can fundamentally shift our relationship to our thoughts and emotions.
One thing that jumped out at me when I was reading through the material was this emphasis on the body. It seems a bit surprising given the focus on thoughts and emotions. Can you talk a bit more about that? Why is the body so important in these therapies?
It might seem surprising at first, but it makes perfect sense when you think about it. Our bodies are constantly giving us information about our internal state, but we often ignore those signals because we're so caught up in our heads.
Yeah, I know I'm guilty of that. I'm definitely more of a head person than a body person.
Well, these therapies are encouraging us to tune back into our bodies. Awareness of physical sensations can be a powerful anchor, a way to ground ourselves when we're feeling overwhelmed or lost in thought.
So it's like adding another layer of information to the puzzle. Instead of just asking, what am I thinking? You're also asking, what am I feeling in my body?
Exactly. And those physical sensations can offer valuable clues about what's going on beneath the surface.
This is also fascinating. It really challenges our traditional ways of thinking about mental health. But I'm wondering, how do we even measure well-being if these therapies are teaching people to feel better even when they're still having negative thoughts?
That's a really important question, and it gets to the heart of how these therapies are changing the game. They're challenging our traditional ways of measuring mental health, and they're prompting us to reconsider what it really means to be, well, it's not just about the absence of symptoms. It's about something much deeper, something more holistic. And I think that's what makes this also exciting.
I agree. I'm definitely feeling a sense of excitement and a lot of curiosity. I feel like we've only just begun to scratch the surface of these therapies.
We have, and that's the beauty of it. There's always more to learn, more to explore.
Well, I can't wait to dive in further.
Me neither. And I'm looking forward to connecting this back to your specific experiences as we go.
Yeah, this is great. Okay, so we've talked about mindfulness and acceptance and how these third wave therapies are really shaking things up. But as someone who likes to understand the why behind things, I'm curious about the underlying philosophy that drives these approaches. I remember coming across something called functional contextualism in those audio lectures you sent. What exactly is that, and how does it relate to all of this?
Oh, that's a great question. And you're right. Functional contextualism is the foundation of many third wave therapies, particularly ACT.
Okay.
It's a way of looking at behavior, thoughts, and emotions in terms of their function or purpose within a specific context.
Uh-huh.
So instead of just labeling a thought as negative or trying to eliminate it, you're asking, what purpose is this thought serving? How is it influencing my actions in this particular situation?
So it's less about the content of the thought and more about its impact on your behavior. That makes me think about how I often get caught up in overthinking, and that definitely affects how I act.
Yeah.
Sometimes I might avoid social situations because I'm worried about what people will think of me.
Exactly. That's a perfect example.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another important concept that's closely tied to functional contextualism, relational frame theory, or RFT.
Okay.
This theory helps us understand why we sometimes get so fused with our thoughts, why we buy into them so completely. It explores how language creates meaning for us and how that meaning can sometimes trap us in unhelpful patterns.
Okay, RFT. To be honest, that one sounded a bit intimidating when I first saw it. Can you break it down a bit further?
Think of it this way. Language is incredibly powerful. It allows us to connect, to learn to build entire worlds in our minds. But it can also be a source of suffering when we become overly attached to the literal meaning of our thoughts.
Yeah.
RFT helps us understand how we learn to relate words and concepts in our minds and how these relationships can lead to unhelpful behaviors, like in your example, the thought, people will judge me, can lead to avoidance, even if it's not necessarily true or helpful.
So our minds are incredibly creative, but sometimes that creativity turns against us. It's almost like our ability to use language, which is such a gift, can also be a double-edged sword.
Precisely. And that's where third wave therapies, particularly ACT, offer a powerful set of tools for defusing from those unhelpful thoughts, for creating some distance between ourselves and our mental chatter.
So it's not about getting rid of those thoughts entirely, but about learning to relate to them differently.
Yes, it's about recognizing that thoughts are just thoughts, mental events that come and go. They don't necessarily reflect reality, and we don't have to believe everything we think.
I'm starting to see how this all ties back to mindfulness. By cultivating that awareness of our thoughts, we can start to see them more objectively, almost as if they're happening outside of us. But how do we actually apply these ideas in everyday life? It's one thing to talk about diffusion and mindfulness, but how do we actually do it?
Well, there are many specific techniques that can help. And what's great is that many of these techniques can be practiced on your own without needing a therapist, for example. One simple technique is called labeling your thoughts. Instead of getting caught up in the content of a thought, you simply label it as thinking. So if you're having the thought, I'm going to mess this up, you can simply say to yourself, thinking.
Huh, that is simple. I imagine that helps create some distance, like you were saying, but does it actually work? I mean, can just labeling a thought really change how you feel?
It might sound surprising, but research suggests that it can. Even simple techniques like this can help to reduce the power that thoughts have over us.
Mm.
And when we can unhook from those unhelpful thoughts, we create space for something else, for values, for committed action, for a richer, more meaningful life.
Okay, I'm intrigued. I'm definitely going to try that labeling technique, as we're talking. I keep thinking back to all the research you mentioned about mindfulness. It's pretty impressive, especially for someone like me who tends to be a bit skeptical, but I have to admit I'm still a bit fuzzy on how it all works.
Well, mindfulness works on multiple levels. It's like training your attention muscle.
Uh-huh.
The more you practice paying attention to the present moment, the stronger that muscle becomes. And the research suggests that this strengthened attention can have a wide range of benefits, from reducing stress and anxiety to improving focus and emotional regulation.
So it's not just about feeling calmer in the moment, it's about rewiring your brain for the better. That's pretty cool. But I'm wondering, is mindfulness something you have to do for hours a day to see any benefit?
Yeah.
Because honestly, I'm not sure I have that kind of time.
That's a common misconception. You don't need to spend hours meditating to reap the benefits of mindfulness.
Yeah.
Even a few minutes a day can make a difference. And the beauty of it is that you can integrate mindfulness into everyday activities.
Oh.
You can practice mindful walking, mindful eating, mindful listening. The possibilities are endless.
Oh, I like that mindfulness on the go. It makes it feel much more accessible. But I'm wondering, Are these third wave therapies, with all this emphasis on mindfulness and acceptance, are they as structured as traditional CBT? Because I know a lot of people find that structure helpful, especially when they're first starting therapy.
That's a great question. While they do draw on evidence-based techniques,
Right.
there's also a strong emphasis on flexibility and individualization in these third-wave therapies. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
So it's more about tailoring the therapy to the person, not the diagnosis. That seems like it would require a really skilled therapist.
It does, and the therapeutic relationship itself is seen as a key part of the healing process. There's a real emphasis on collaboration, on genuineness, on meeting the client where they are.
It sounds like there's a real art to these therapies as well as a science.
Absolutely, and that's what makes them so exciting. It's not just about following a protocol, it's about creating a space for healing and growth.
One concept that I found really intriguing, particularly in DBT, is radical acceptance. It seems almost paradoxical, accepting something you desperately want to change. How does that actually work?
It does seem paradoxical, doesn't it? But that's the power of dialectics, which is central to DBT.
Okay.
It's about holding two seemingly opposite truths at the same time, the need for change and the acceptance of what is.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we can't change something until we fully accept it.
So it's not about resigning yourself to a situation, but about creating a starting point for change. But how do you accept something you hate, like chronic pain or severe anxiety? I mean, isn't that just giving up?
It's a valid concern, and it's important to understand what acceptance doesn't mean. It doesn't mean liking or approving of the situation, and it certainly doesn't mean giving up on making things better. What it means is acknowledging reality as it is without resistance or judgment.
Okay.
It's about saying, okay, this is what's happening right now.
Yeah.
How can I move forward from here?
Okay, that makes a little more sense. So it's about choosing how you respond to the situation rather than being controlled by it.
Exactly. And that choice, that agency is a powerful antidote to feeling helpless or overwhelmed. It's about recognizing that even in the midst of pain or difficulty, we still have a choice in how we respond.
This all ties back to that idea of psychological flexibility, right? The ability to adapt and respond effectively even when things are tough.
Precisely. And psychological flexibility is like a muscle that we can strengthen through practice like mindfulness and acceptance. It's about learning to be present with our experience, to open up to our emotions, and to choose actions that are in line with our values, even when those emotions are urging us to do otherwise.
As we're talking about this, I'm realizing how much these therapies challenge traditional notions of mental health. It's not just about fixing what's broken, it's about cultivating a new way of being in the world.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we're not just our thoughts and emotions. We have the capacity to observe them, to relate to them differently, and to choose how we respond to them.
We touched on this earlier, but I'd love to circle back to the role of the body in these therapies. It seems like we're finally starting to appreciate the mind-body connection in a more holistic way, but I'm still a bit curious about how this translates into practical terms.
Well, for starters, it means paying attention to the signals our bodies are sending us.
Okay.
We often ignore these signals, especially when we're stressed or anxious, but our bodies hold a wealth of information about how we're feeling and what we need.
So it's about tuning into those physical sensations, even if they're uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's about noticing the tightness in your chest, the butterflies in your stomach, the tension in your shoulders. And it's not about trying to get rid of those sensations, but about acknowledging them, exploring them with curiosity, and seeing what they can teach us.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm wondering, how do you actually do that? I mean, I'm so used to being in my head, I'm not even sure I know how to connect with my body.
Well, there are many practices that can help with that. Yoga and mindful movement are great options, and even something as simple as taking a few deep breaths can help to shift your attention from your thoughts to your body.
I'm starting to see how this all connects by paying attention to our bodies. We're not only gaining valuable information about our emotional state, but we're also creating a sense of grounding and presence.
Yes, and that sense of grounding can be incredibly helpful, especially when you're feeling overwhelmed or lost in thought. It's like having an anchor that keeps you from getting swept away by the current.
I like that analogy. So it's not about ignoring our thoughts and emotions, but about having a more balanced relationship with them. We're acknowledging our thoughts and feelings, paying attention to our bodies, and choosing actions that are in line with our values. It's a more holistic approach to well-being.
Exactly, and it's a journey, not a destination. It's an ongoing process of learning, growing, and evolving.
As I'm listening to you talk about all this, I'm realizing how much these third wave therapies are challenging the status quo. They're not just about tweaking the old ways of doing things. They're about creating something entirely new.
That's a great observation. And it's not always easy. There's resistance, there's skepticism, but I think that's a good thing. It means we're pushing boundaries, we're asking tough questions, we're not settling for the status quo.
We're disrupting the paradigm, but wouldn't that make it harder for these therapies to gain wider acceptance?
It might in the short term, but I think in the long run, this disruption is essential. It's creating space for new ideas, for new ways of understanding and treating mental health, and ultimately that's what's going to lead to greater healing and well-being for more people.
I agree. It feels like we're on the cusp of something truly transformative. But I'm wondering, what does this all mean for the future of therapy? Where do you see all of this going?
That's a fascinating question, and one that I don't have a definitive answer to, but I do see a number of exciting trends emerging.
Like, what are you most excited about?
Well, for one, I think we're going to see an increasing integration of mindfulness and acceptance into mainstream therapy. These concepts are no longer fringe ideas. They're becoming increasingly accepted and integrated into different approaches.
So you think these third wave approaches are going to become more mainstream? That would be amazing.
I do, and I think technology is going to play a big role in making these therapies more accessible and affordable.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. I mean, we're already seeing a surge in telehealth, which is great for people who live in rural areas or have mobility challenges. And there are so many apps out there that can support people in practicing mindfulness and developing coping skills.
Exactly. Technology has the potential to reach people who might not otherwise have access to these therapies. But it's important to remember that technology is just a tool. It can enhance therapy, but it can't replace the human connection that's so essential to healing.
Right. It's all about finding that balance.
Yeah.
So if you were talking to someone who is struggling with a mental health challenge, what would be the key takeaway message from all of this?
The key takeaway message is that there's hope. There are new and innovative approaches to therapy that are proving to be incredibly effective, and there are more and more resources available to support people in finding the right therapist and the right approach for their needs.
That's such a powerful message of hope. And it's a message that needs to be heard too often. People suffer in silence, feeling ashamed or hopeless. But it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be that way.
Absolutely. And what's so inspiring about these third wave therapies is that they're not just about symptom reduction. They're about empowering people to live richer, more meaningful lives, even in the presence of challenges.
They're about embracing the full spectrum of human experience with all its messiness and beauty.
Beautifully said, and I think that's a perfect place to pause. For now, we've covered a lot of ground, and it's important to give ourselves time to digest all of this information.
We'll be back soon for the final part of our deep dive. Welcome back. It's amazing how much ground we've covered in this deep dive, from the evolution of behavior therapy to the nuances of these third wave approaches.
I know, right? It's pretty amazing.
It feels like we've journeyed through a whole new landscape of understanding mental health.
It has been quite a journey, and you know what strikes me the most is how these third wave therapies really encourage a shift in perspective.
Yeah.
It's not just about fixing problems, it's about transforming our relationship to them.
That really resonates with me. I've always been someone who tries to solve problems to figure things out,
Huh.
but I'm starting to see how that mindset can sometimes keep me stuck, especially when it comes to difficult emotions.
That's a really insightful observation, and you're not alone in that many of us are conditioned to think that the way to feel better is to get rid of uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. But these third wave therapies are suggesting a different path.
Yeah, instead of trying to eliminate those emotions, we're learning to make space for them, to accept them as part of the human experience, which, I'll be honest, still feels a bit counterintuitive to me.
It is counterintuitive and it takes practice. But what's fascinating is that the research suggests that acceptance can actually decrease the intensity of difficult emotions.
Wait, really? How does that work?
It's like when we stop fighting a wave, it loses its power to knock us down. When we resist our emotions, we create more tension and struggle. But when we accept them, we create space for them to flow through us without overwhelming us.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like that saying what you resist persists.
Exactly. Acceptance doesn't mean liking or approving of our emotions. It's simply acknowledging their presence without judgment, and that can be incredibly freeing.
As we're talking about this, I'm realizing how important self-compassion is in all of this. If we're constantly beating ourselves up for having these difficult emotions, how can we ever truly accept them?
That's such an important point. Self-compassion is a crucial part of this process. It's about treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a friend who is struggling.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that we're all perfectly imperfect human beings.
We are, and that's okay. In fact, it's more than okay. It's part of what makes us human.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, and I'm walking away with a renewed sense of hope and possibility. I feel like I have a whole new set of tools for navigating the ups and downs of life.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
And remember, this is just the beginning of your exploration. There's a whole world of resources and practices out there to support you on this journey.
You've definitely sparked my curiosity, and that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
Approaching life with curiosity, openness, and a willingness to learn and grow.
Absolutely. And remember, the journey of well-being is not about achieving some perfect state of happiness. It's about embracing the full tapestry of human experience with all its joys and sorrows, challenges and triumphs.
Well said. This deep dive has been truly enlightening. Thank you for guiding me through it.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, you have the power to create a richer, more meaningful life starting right now.
To all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it as thought-provoking and inspiring as we have. Until next time, keep exploring.